Starting with number 10 now, we have David Reimer. When this Canadian man was born in 1965, he was sent to be circumcised, but the doctors experimented with an unconventional technique and ended up removing David's entire penis. Now, doctors told his parents the best solution would be to give him a sex change operation right there and then, raise him as a girl, and never let him know the truth. This ended up tearing his parents apart, and his dad told David the truth when he was 14. David then chose to get a reverse sex operation. It was a success. However, David struggled a lot with the events of his past and ended up committing suicide at just 38 years old. At number 9 now, we have the chimp baby. In the 1930s, a scientist called Winthrop Kellogg thought a chimp could grow up to be like a human if it lived alongside a human baby, his own son. For 9 months, he conducted experiments, and his son Donald was inseparable from the chimp called Gua. They ate together and they played together. They noticed that Gua was picking up more and more human tendencies from Donald than ever before, but the experiment came to an abrupt halt when Donald, the human baby, began to regress and become more like a chimp. Apparently, he would just sit there howling and wailing and would struggle to pick up even basic language like a normal human baby. The experiment was stopped immediately. Alright, at number 8 now, we have the monster study. This 1939 experiment was conducted on 22 orphans to see how children responded to positivity and negativity when it comes to speech therapy. Half the children were praised for their efforts, while the other half were teased and belittled for their speech imperfections. Many of the children who received this negative feedback went on to suffer serious psychological damage for the rest of their lives. It was so bad that some of them could barely even speak again. The monster study got its name from its shocking experimentation on orphan children just to prove a hypothesis. Alright guys, coming in at number 7 now, we have Thusco. This one was just messed up, if I'm honest. In 1962, when the CIA was absolutely obsessed with finding out the effects of LSD, they experimented on an elephant with the help of the University of Oklahoma. The elephant, called Thusco, weighed 3.5 tons and was given enough LSD to make 3,000 humans hallucinate. The CIA were trying to see if they could make the elephant enter must, which is a naturally occurring state where elephants become violent and uncontrollable. The experiment was a total disaster. Thusco almost immediately collapsed and had a seizure for almost 2 hours before finally dying. At number 6 now, we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. This psychology experiment conducted by Stanford University involved splitting 24 random students into 2 groups. One group were the prison guards and the others were their prisoners. This was set up for them to study how power and authority works within human groups, but it got really messed up. It was supposed to last 2 weeks, but had to be stopped after just 6 days because the guards began to abuse their power. They would emotionally and physically abuse the prisoners. After just the first day alone, the guards were already attacking them with fire extinguishers. Yeah. Some of them suffered serious mental and physical injuries for life. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the yellow fever experiment. Dr. Firth was a scientist who was trying to prove that yellow fever was not contagious and was actually due to the difference between summer and winter. Now, in an effort to prove this, he tried to infect himself with yellow fever by drinking the vomit of victims. He also injected it into his body and even poured it onto his eyes. Well, it turns out he was right about the whole seasonal thing, but for the wrong reason. It's mosquitoes that are the ones who spread yellow fever, and they hibernate in the winter, so all the vomit drinking and pouring in the eyes was for nothing. At the number 4 spot now, we have testicle radiation. In 1963, researchers offered prisoners in the Washington and Oregon area $25 to participate in reproductive radiation tests. Now, they were told they wanted to see how a normal dose of X-ray level radiation would affect a man's testicles. Instead, they hit them with about 6 times that amount of radiation. The prisoners, as you might expect, developed testicular cancer, they became sterile and had many other health problems. The class action lawsuit only gave $2,000 to each of the victims. We're at the number 3 spot now, and we have TGN-1412. This was the name of an experimental drug used to treat leukemia. As with most drugs for humans, it was first tested on animals to see if it was non-fatal. It wasn't. In fact, everything was fine with the animals. They moved on to testing the drug on humans, and just to be safe, they gave them a dose 500 times lower than the level found safe in animals. 6 of the test subjects were hospitalized with massive organ failure. The trial was stopped, and researchers started to work on why this drug was fine in the animals but almost killed 6 humans that it was given to. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the Guatemala syphilis experiment. This experiment involved US-backed Guatemalan doctors infecting soldiers, prisoners, prisoners and prostitutes in Guatemala with syphilis in order to study it. They wanted to see what the effectiveness of penicillin was on syphilis, except they only used penicillin on about half of the 1,308 people involved in the study. At least 83 people died, and 63 years later, President Barack Obama apologized on behalf of the US to the Guatemalan president. And finally, at number 1 now, we have MK Ultra. This CIA experiment was conducted in the 50s and the 60s in an effort to see if LSD and other drugs could mind control people. They tested the drug on countless unwitting citizens. Some of them weren't even American. Many of them suffered life-altering mental conditions and became very unstable. Those that tried to speak out about what had happened met mysterious deaths, such as suspicious suicides. Not surprisingly, most of the documents involved with these shocking experiments were later destroyed. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Milgram experiment. If any of you guys have studied psychology at school, you've probably heard of this one. Stanley Milgram was a psychologist who conducted a study in America to see how far people would go when obeying an authority figure. The participants were told they were to give small electric shocks to other participants behind a wall every time they answered a question incorrectly. In reality, the electric shocks were fake and the other participants were just actors. Amazingly, even when the fake test subjects screamed out in pain, many of the participants would continue to administer what would have been fatal electric shocks just because the doctor urged them to continue. Many of the people involved in this claim they were traumatized for life, and the study has been ethically criticized in the years since. Moving on to number 9 now, we have the Challenger explosion. On January 28, 1986, the NASA Space Shuttle Challenger launched from Florida. On board were 5 astronauts and 2 payload specialists who were going to conduct research in space. 73 seconds into the flight, the ship broke apart and disintegrated over the Atlantic Ocean. There were no survivors. After an investigation, it was determined that the fault lied with the design of the shuttle's O-rings. This was a problem which NASA had actually known about for almost 10 years, but those higher up in the organization had refused to listen to the concerns of engineers who thought a disaster like this could happen. The shuttle program was stopped for almost 3 years while investigations and improvements were made. Next up at number 8 now, we have the air crash. Jean-François de Rosier was a French teacher of physics and chemistry during the late 18th century. He also had a passion for aviation and conducted many experiments using a hot air balloon. Eventually, he decided to push the balloon to its limit by attempting to cross the English Channel. On the 15th of June 1785, his attempt ended in disaster when the balloon was blown off course and deflated at a height of 1,500 feet. De Rosier was killed and his wife died 8 days later from suspected suicide. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Unit 731. This was a secret unit of the Japanese army during World War II that carried out horrific experiments on civilians and prisoners. It's estimated that the project involved 250,000 men, women and children. Most of them were Chinese, along with some prisoners of war from Russia and the Allies. The procedures conducted on the patients included cutting them open without anesthesia, unnecessary amputations, and removal of organs such as the brain, liver and lungs. Others were used for weapons testing and died to grenades or flamethrowers. The true extent of the suffering is still being discovered today. Next up, number 6 now, we have the X-ray. Clarence Madison Daly was Thomas Edison's assistant. Now you might know Thomas Edison as the inventor of the light bulb, but he is also known for his work on X-rays. In the early days of X-ray researching, nobody realized just how dangerous they could be without taking the proper precautions. Daly acted as Edison's test subject and ended up getting radiation damage to his hands and face that required him to take time off work. At first, one of his hands was amputated and then 4 fingers on the other. Eventually, the cancer spread and he needed both arms amputated before eventually dying. He is thought to be the first American to die from the effects of experimentation with radiation. After this, Thomas Edison abandoned his research on X-rays, stating, "Don't talk to me about X-rays, I am afraid of them." Alright, next up at number 5 now, we have the nuclear bomb. In 1934, scientist Enrico Fermi bombarded uranium with neutrons and created what he thought was a new artificial element in the periodic table. He won a Nobel Prize for his work. Over the next few years, scientists began to realize that what had actually happened was that the uranium atom had been split in 2. This had the potential to release huge amounts of energy that could be used for power or to build a devastating bomb. During World War II, the US set up the Manhattan Project to explore this option. It took just a few years for them to perfect the bomb. 2 of them were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing 150,000 people and many more from radiation. Japan surrendered soon after, bringing an end to World War II. Some scientists who worked on the first study studies of nuclear fission were horrified that their discoveries had been used for such violence. Others felt it was the only way to end that war. Next up at number 4 now we have Carl Scheele. He was a Swedish and German chemist who made a number of chemical discoveries during the late 18th century. These include the likes of molybdenum, tungsten, manganese and chloride. Unfortunately, Scheele liked to taste the new chemicals that he had discovered. Any chemist will tell you this is probably not a good idea, especially when one of his discoveries was hydrogen cyanide, the key word there being cyanide. Eventually the experiments caught up to him and Scheele died aged 43 from symptoms that resembled mercury poisoning. Moving on to number 3 now we have Alexander Bogdanov. He was a Russian doctor and philosopher known for his work on blood transfusion. He used himself as the test subject and conducted 11 transfusions which he claimed had stopped his boarding and improved his eyesight. Bogdanov was a pioneer in blood transfusion, and that's the key thing to remember here, a pioneer. Nobody fully understood the dangers of it, including him. In 1928 he took a blood transfusion from a person infected with malaria and tuberculosis. As you might expect, he died shortly after. Next up at number 2 now we have Joseph Mengele. To call these science experiments may not even be fair, some might just call them torture. Mengele was a Nazi doctor who carried out medical experiments on thousands of prisoners in concentration camps during the Holocaust. He would purposefully induce hypothermia, infect them with malaria or force them to inhale mustard gas, all to just see the effects. He would also forcibly sterilize people and infect wounds with bacteria, as well as filling them with wood shavings and ground glass. He's perhaps most famous though for his obsession with twins. He was known to have once sewed 2 twins together in a twisted effort to create conjoined twins. And finally, number 1 now we have Marie Curie. She is one of the most famous scientists of all time, and for good reason. Born in Poland, she went on to become the only scientist to ever win the Nobel Prize in 2 separate fields of study, chemistry and physics. She studied a number of radioactive isotopes and discovered the elements of polonium and radium. She also developed mobile radiography units to provide X-rays to field hospitals. Her work was groundbreaking, but as you might expect, radiation was not fully understood at the turn of the 20th century. Her constant exposure to this radiation led to her getting leukemia. She eventually died from aplastic anemia.
Starting us off at number 10 is the sex reassignment trial. Psychologist and sexual behavior expert Dr. John William Money fully believed that gender was something that was learned rather than something that was innate and that you were born with. In 1965, David Peter Reimer was born biologically a male, meaning he had a penis. At 7 months old, he underwent his circumcision that was weirdly done via cauterization. The doctor messed up and his penis was accidentally destroyed, and this is where Dr. Money stepped in and convinced David's parents that he would be able to successfully sexually mature if they raised him as a girl. Money made David his own little experiment, and despite reporting continued success, David's perspective was vastly different. David shared he never identified as a female and was constantly teased by everyone growing up. By the time he was 13, he told his parents he was experiencing suicidal depression and would commit suicide if they ever made him meet Dr. Money again. That's when the parents came clean about the sex reassignment, and David decided to live as a male at 14 years old onwards. Sadly, he committed suicide at the age of 38. And just to be clear, I hate how this doctor made David's whole life his own science experiment. That's ridiculous. And just to be clear, I personally support the trans community. I fully believe you can be born biologically female or male, but identify as something else. Live your truth, people. Live your truth. Coming in at number 9, we have Adam and Eve. Now this one was really interesting to read about, so hopefully you guys will like it too. And if you don't, well, sucks to suck because I like it. Ha ha ha. So if we go back to medieval Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II carried out what he called experiments, but were actually barbaric acts of torture. His sidekick was this ruthless Italian monk who wasn't gonna sit there and be like, oh Fred, maybe you shouldn't do that. He was like, yes, do it. Now the Emperor's infinite quest in life was discovering the language of God, and to do that he decided to experiment on 2 infants by keeping them from interacting with any human since the day they were born. Frederick thought without any human interaction they would learn the language of Adam and Eve, but as you could probably guess, it was an epic fail. The duo acted like complete savages, could not communicate at all, and eventually died in animal cage-like conditions. At number 8 we have mind control, and this one was wild. So back in the 60s, a Yale University professor by the name of Jose Delgado was hell-bent on finding a way to control the human mind and its actions, and therefore turn society into some sort of psycho-civilization. And I'm so glad he failed. This guy sounds like one of those I'm gonna take over the world types, and we don't have time for that. Now he invented the stim receiver that was essentially a radio that could apparently control the mind after being inserted into the brain. Jose first tested it on a raging bull and managed to successfully stop it, so people deemed the device a success. This time receiver could stimulate your emotions and control physical reactions. He then planted it into a woman's brain that caused her to lose her motor skills and be very erotically stimulated. She even developed ulcers on her fingers from how often she'd adjust the amplitude dial of the device. Like, what is this experiment? It legit sounds like an episode of Black Mirror come to life, but way before its time. Can you imagine if this really succeeded exactly how Jose would have wanted? Like, what would this world be like right now? I'd have a chip implant in my brain. Filling Annam 7 slot is Radioactivity Part 1. During the years 1963 and 1973, the US government was very interested in the effects of radiation with the Cold War and their rivalry with the Soviet Union, etc. So partnering up with the University of Washington, the university conducted an experiment wherein they got 130 inmates in Washington and Oregon prisons to voluntarily subject themselves to radiation in the testicles. In most of the cases, the person was zapped with over 400 rads of radiation in the testes, which is the equivalent of 2,400 chest x-rays. And of course, the men were never told how dangerous volunteering actually was. In 2000, the former participants thankfully sued and got a $2.4 million settlement from the university, but what the F? I feel like most of the inmates, if not all of them, definitely contracted testicular cancer. Like, how is that okay? 400 rads? Like, I don't even know what to say. I don't know what to say. Inmates are humans too. We all make mistakes. Unless you're like a pedophile rapist, then I hate you. Now, number 6 is the sand flea. Now, the sand flea, also known as the chigger flea, is disgusting, but then aren't all fleas? They burrow themselves inside a warm-blooded host, for example, a human, and inside us it swells, it and then lays eggs before dying a month or so later. Either way, Marlene Telecki, a PhD student from Berlin, was studying in Madagascar, and part of her job was to evaluate and record the developmental stages of sand fleas. Well, turns out she thought the best way to do her research was to let a sand flea live inside her own foot for 2 months. And mind you, one flea inside you automatically attracts others to you as well, so like, I don't know what this woman was thinking. Either way, she started intimately observing her foot, and the flea didn't really bother her. I don't understand, like, even this is like cringing me out. It was growing normally but wasn't laying eggs, which was odd for a mature sand flea. Marlene then realized, wait a minute, it's still alive, it's been 2 months, it should have been dead by now, and it still hasn't had kids. Turns out, this sand flea was a virgin and was stuck in the waiting stage of thinking a male was gonna come and fertilize it. Either way, that experiment was a low-key fail, but who willingly hosts a flea inside their foot, dude? Like, come on, I can't. Coming in at number 5 is the pneumonia torture experiment. Dr. Walter Jones, a physician from Petersburg, Virginia, was worried about the typhoid pneumonia outbreak that was occurring during the 1840s. Now, to try and cure the disease, he conducted an experiment using many 15 to 30-year-old male African slaves that were working on plantations in Virginia. His method was pouring boiling water on them. Look, I don't know what the science behind that was. Maybe he thought it would kill all the germs and bacteria. I really don't know. He did this to subjects who had symptoms like a high fever, nausea, diarrhea, sore throats, etc. A witness said that Jones once poured 5 gallons of boiling water on the back of one 25-year-old subject. Now, he claimed the experiment was a success and that it cured many subjects, but that was A, never verified, B, false, C, racist, and D, all levels of unethical. Need I say more? There needs to be no E. I've said it all. At number 4 is Radioactivity Part 2. You guys are probably wondering, why is Part 2 not after Part 1? Haha, plot twist, it's now. Now again, set your minds back to post-World War II, Cold War, international climate, the arms race is going, communism versus capitalism is full speed ahead, and the American side is heavily focusing on radiation and possibilities of chemical warfare. In an experiment undertaken at Vanderbilt University, 829 pregnant women were told that if they drank these specific vitamin drinks daily, it would improve not only their own health, but the health of their unborn children too. And this vitamin drink was not a vitamin drink. Plot twist, it was actually filled with radioactive iron because the researchers were testing how quickly the radioisotope entered into the placenta. Radioactivity and babies? That's never a good mix. At least 7 of the babies died after birth due to leukemia or different forms of cancer. The women themselves experienced extreme hair and tooth loss, anemia, rashes, bruises, and of course, cancer. Filling at number 3 slot is the Aversion Project. I hate everything about this one, just absolutely everything. So during South Africa's disgusting apartheid period, the year was 1969, and it wasn't only black people they didn't like, it was homosexuals as well. So thousands and thousands of men were given to Dr. Aubrey Levin, a former army colonel and psychologist. Now Aubrey was convinced he could cure homosexuality using electroconvulsive aversion therapy to reorientate them to liking women. The electrodes were strapped to the subject's arm and it was obviously connected to a dial going from 1 to 10. The experiment involved Aubrey showing the men pictures of naked men and asking them to fantasize about these pictures, and as soon as they started to do so, they would be given severe shocks. The experiment was a complete show. It was cruel, it was against human rights, it didn't work, and as soon as he learned he would be named a human rights abuser, he fled to Canada, and he's literally still here working at a teaching hospital. Like, this man should not be allowed to teach anyone. You can't shock someone into liking the other gender, that doesn't work. Aubrey. Now at number 2 is the Hoffling Hospital experiment. Back in 1969, psychiatrist Charles K. Hoffling decided to conduct a field experiment testing levels of obedience to authority figures, and in this case between a nurse and a doctor. It involved 22 nurses getting a call from a doctor saying the nurse had to administer 20 milligrams of a fictitious drug called Astrotin to a patient and that the doctor would later sign for it. Now Astrotin is not on the approved drug list, and on the bottle it said 10 milligrams was the maximum daily dosage. And keep in mind the doctor told them to administer 20 milligrams. Hoffling then asked 21 nursing students and 12 nurses whether the nurses in the experiment would obey the doctor, suppress their own judgment and administer the lethal dose, or would they not. Out of them, 10 nurses and all the students said they would not do it, but in the experiment, 21 out of 22 nurses actually did it, and in real life, that would have killed the patient. And this blew my mind. The nurses in the experiment were also given a questionnaire, and all of them stated they would not obey the orders of the doctor, yet 21 out of 22 did. I feel like that really goes to show how weirdly our minds are wired and how authority is so overarching. 21 of you out here killing patients because you think Dr. What's-His-Face knows better than you do. And finally, at number 1 is the mustard gas experiment. The year is 1943, we are close to the end of World War II, and the Navy has had enough. They were testing the effectiveness of new gas masks and clothing against things like deadly gas, which had been such a huge blow to them in World War I. They were like, fool us once, shame on you. Fool us twice, shame on us. We aren't playing again. Mustard gas, not today. So in one of the worst experiments ever undertaken by the Naval Research Lab, they went and asked a bunch of 17 and 18-year-old boys who had just completed 8 weeks of boot camp if they wanted to volunteer for an experiment that would shorten the war. And in that scenario, who's gonna say no? It was only when they got to the lab did they realize the experiment involved mustard gas. Now all participants suffered severe internal and external burns, and all that was completely brushed off by the Navy. The Navy even threatened them with the Espionage Act if they tried to take action against them.